There is a strange moment in the life of almost every collectible. At first, nobody wants it. It is produced in enormous numbers, used without much thought, and eventually pushed into a cupboard, a loft, a garage, or a drawer. Then the years pass. People move house, families clear estates, broken examples disappear, boxes are thrown away, accessories are separated, and gradually, without anyone announcing it, the supply begins to shrink. That is when an ordinary object can become something very different. The interesting part is that you do not need to own an antique to be looking at the beginning of a future collecting market. Some of the objects worth watching were manufactured during our own lifetimes. They are things people once considered disposable, unfashionable, outdated, or simply too common to bother keeping. And that creates an unusual opportunity. Because if you can recognize the difference between something merely old and something genuinely collectible, you may already have a few candidates sitting around your home. This is not a promise that every old object will become valuable. Far from it. Most modern possessions will remain ordinary. A famous brand name alone is not enough. Age alone is not enough. And something being described online as rare does not automatically make it desirable. What matters is the combination of scarcity, condition, history, completeness, cultural memory, and the number of people who eventually want the object. So today, we are looking at 15 everyday categories that could become increasingly interesting to collectors in the future. They begin with objects that can already command respectable prices in the right circumstances, and gradually move toward items where a single surviving example can be worth astonishing sums. And the most important example is saved for the end, because it demonstrates the central lesson of the entire list better than anything else. Before we begin, remember one simple rule. Do not assume that every example is valuable. Instead, learn what separates the ordinary pieces from the unusual ones. That distinction is where the real story begins. Number 15. Patterned Pyrex. Look inside an older kitchen cupboard, and there is a good chance you will find something that looks almost too ordinary to notice. A mixing bowl, a casserole dish, perhaps a brightly patterned piece of Pyrex that has survived several kitchens, several generations, and countless family meals. For years, objects like these were treated as practical household equipment rather than collectibles, and that is precisely what makes them interesting today. The important distinction is between plain, common examples and the patterned pieces that have developed a following among collectors. Certain designs from the middle decades of the 20th century have become much more desirable, with sought-after examples selling for hundreds, and particularly scarce promotional patterns reaching considerably higher prices. The pattern is often more important than the fact that the object is Pyrex. That is the detail a casual owner can easily miss. Two dishes can look almost identical in age and condition, yet one may be worth very little, while another attracts serious collector interest because of its specific design. So, if there is an old printed piece sitting in your kitchen, photograph the pattern before doing anything with it, and be careful with cleaning. The decorative surface is part of the object's identity, and aggressive washing can damage precisely the feature collectors are interested in. There is something rather satisfying about this category. These were made to be used. They were exposed to heat, food, washing, cupboards, moving houses, and everyday accidents. The examples that survived in recognizable condition are therefore becoming a smaller group. And that brings us to an important principle that will appear repeatedly throughout this list. Sometimes the future value of an object begins with nothing more complicated than survival. Number 14. Old cast iron cookware. There is another object that often survives because somebody simply refuses to throw it away. An old cast iron skillet. It may be heavy enough to make a modern cook wonder why anyone ever wanted one in the first place. The surface may look dark and worn, and the handle may carry years of evidence that somebody actually used the pan. But the right old example can be far more interesting than its appearance suggests. Collectors pay particular attention to historic American makers such as Griswold and Wagner, especially when the markings, size, form, and condition identify an uncommon example. Ordinary old cast iron is not automatically valuable. That point matters. A rusty pan without an interesting maker or desirable characteristics may simply be an old pan. But a recognized maker, an unusual size, or a scarce form can change the picture dramatically, with desirable pieces reaching hundreds of dollars and exceptional examples going substantially higher. The first thing to do is remarkably simple. Turn the pan over. Look at the base. Manufacturers, markings, numbers, and other identifying details can tell you far more than the appearance of the cooking surface. And do not assume that rust means the object is worthless. Surface rust can often be dealt with, whereas replacing an original historical object is impossible. What makes this category particularly fascinating is the meeting point between utility and collecting. These are not objects that became interesting only because someone decided they looked good on a shelf. People still use them. Cooks appreciate the qualities of older cast iron, while collectors appreciate the manufacturing history behind it. That combination gives the category a reason to remain relevant. And if your family has always regarded one particular skillet as too heavy, too old, or too inconvenient to throw away, perhaps there was a reason. Number 13. Vintage hand tools. Now leave the kitchen and walk into the garage. There may be a wooden-handled plane, a brace, a set of chisels, or a heavy tool that has been sitting untouched since somebody's grandfather last used it. Modern eyes can make these objects look almost primitive. That is part of their appeal. The best vintage hand tools were made during a period when manufacturers expected them to be repaired, maintained, and used for decades. Names matter here. Numbered Stanley planes, for example, can attract collectors, while unusual models and higher-end makers can command much more. Norris planes and traditional infill designs are particularly interesting, and old Sheffield tools, especially complete boxed sets, can have their own dedicated following. But again, the age of the tool is only the beginning. The maker, model, materials, condition, completeness, and rarity all matter. A pile of anonymous modern tools is not suddenly a treasure because it has been sitting in a shed for 30 years. The test is straightforward. Read the markings. Look for manufacturer names and model numbers. Examine the wood, brass fittings, handles, blades, and original boxes. And resist the temptation to judge an old tool simply by whether you would use it today. Collectors are often buying something different from a modern consumer. They are buying evidence of how things were made. The irony is that the very qualities that made these tools seem outdated may eventually be the qualities that make them desirable. Mass production made modern tools easier to obtain. It also made many older manufacturing traditions disappear. And once those traditions disappear, the surviving examples begin to tell the story. Number 12. Vinyl records, from the modern revival. For years, people assumed vinyl had already had its final chapter. Then it returned. What makes the modern vinyl market particularly interesting is that future collectors are not limited to records from the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. Some of today's records may eventually become the older records of tomorrow. Limited pressings, colored vinyl, numbered editions, small production runs, and early releases from artists who later became enormously successful can all create a different collecting story. Some modern examples have already sold for tens or hundreds rather than the few pounds many ordinary records might command. But the most interesting part is not today's price, it is tomorrow's memory. Imagine being 20 years older and remembering the first album you bought from an artist who eventually became one of the defining musicians of your generation. That emotional connection is one of the forces behind collecting. People do not simply buy objects, they buy pieces of their own history. If you have modern records that were marketed as limited or numbered editions, those are worth separating from ordinary mass-market pressings. And if something remains sealed, preserving that condition can be particularly important. Store records upright, away from sunlight and damaging conditions. Warping, scratches, damaged sleeves and ring wear can all change the desirability of an otherwise interesting pressing. The future market will not necessarily reward every record from our era. It will reward the survivors that future collectors actually remember. And that distinction becomes even more important with the next category. Number 11, CDs and cassette tapes. There was a time when people could hardly give these away. Entire carloads of CDs were taken to charity shops. Cassette collections disappeared into boxes. Physical music seemed destined to become another abandoned technology. Then collecting did what collecting so often does. It looked backward. Early pressings, unusual editions, Japanese releases, limited versions, sealed copies and cassettes connected to culturally important albums have begun attracting renewed interest. The cassette is particularly interesting because it was once regarded as one of the least glamorous music formats imaginable. That is exactly the kind of reputation that can make a surviving example fascinating decades later. Most CDs and cassettes will remain common. There is no reason to believe that every disc in an old music collection will become valuable. But a collection containing sealed copies, early pressings, unusual catalogue numbers, limited editions or significant releases deserves more careful sorting before it goes into a charity shop box. Look closely at the small print. The catalogue number can matter, the pressing can matter, the country of manufacture can matter, the condition can matter, and the history behind the release can matter most of all. There is also a broader lesson here. Technology rarely disappears as completely as people imagine. The format that seemed obsolete can become historically interesting once an entire generation grows up without using it. Today, a cassette may be an inconvenience. In another generation, it may be a physical reminder of how people once experienced music. And nostalgia is one of the most powerful forces in collecting. Number 10, film cameras. Now consider something that many people once assumed had been completely replaced: the film camera. There are probably thousands of old cameras sitting in drawers, cupboards, camera bags and boxes around the world. Some are ordinary, others have become surprisingly desirable. The resurgence of film photography has brought renewed attention to certain compact cameras, SLRs, lenses and accessories. Premium models such as the Contax T2 and T3 and sought-after compact cameras from manufacturers such as Olympus, Canon and Nikon have attracted prices far beyond what their original owners might have expected decades ago. This is a perfect example of a category being transformed by a new generation. Young photographers discovered something their parents had considered inconvenient. The limitations became part of the experience. Film had a physical process. You had to choose your shots. You could not instantly review every photograph. The camera itself became part of the ritual. That changed how people viewed equipment that had once seemed obsolete. If you have an old camera, do not judge it by appearance alone. Find the exact model. Check whether it works. Look for the original lens, case, manuals, flash, straps, and other accessories. Sometimes the accessory that was thrown into the camera bag without a second thought can be surprisingly important. And there is another reason this category deserves attention. A young generation has already demonstrated that it is willing to spend money on technology that previous generations considered outdated. That tells us something about the future. What looks obsolete today may simply be waiting for a new audience. Number 9. Vintage denim and workwear. There are few everyday objects more closely connected to ordinary life than clothing, and yet some clothing can become highly collectible. Vintage denim is one of the clearest examples. Old jeans, work jackets, specialist workwear, and unusual garments can attract serious attention when their age, construction, manufacturer, and provenance line up. Collectors look for details that most people would overlook: a particular label, a specific button, the construction of the seams, selvage denim, older manufacturers' markings, and in some cases, the famous Big E Levi's tab associated with earlier production. These details can turn a pair of old jeans from something sitting at the bottom of a wardrobe into something worth researching. There is also an important lesson about condition here. With many collectible objects, people assume cleaner means better. Clothing can be different. Original wear can be evidence. The fading, repairs, creases, and marks created through years of use can help tell the story of the garment. That does not mean every damaged pair of jeans is valuable. It means that unnecessary restoration can sometimes remove the very characteristics collectors want to preserve. The extraordinary prices achieved by certain historic denim pieces demonstrate how far this market can go. One particularly notable pair, dating to the 19th century, was sold at auction for tens of thousands of dollars. Think about that for a moment. The object began as work clothing. Its original owner almost certainly did not think of it as an investment. It became interesting because it survived. That theme is becoming harder to ignore. And the next category takes the same idea into music culture. Number 8. Vintage concert and band t-shirts. At the bottom of an old wardrobe, there may be a shirt that someone in the family refuses to throw away. It is faded, the graphic may be cracked, the fabric may be worn. Perhaps there are even small holes. To someone cleaning the house, it looks like rubbish. To a collector, those imperfections may be clues. Vintage concert and band t-shirts can become valuable when they document a particular tour, artist, period, or cultural moment. The shirt may carry dates on the back. The label can reveal when and where it was manufactured. The printing method, stitching, fabric, and graphics can help establish authenticity. And that last word is crucial: authenticity. A modern reproduction of a famous concert design may look almost identical to a casual observer. A genuine shirt connected to the original event is a completely different object. That is why collectors examine the small details. Before giving away an old concert shirt, photograph both sides, record the label, note the tour dates, and search the exact design. Do not wash or alter something simply because it looks old. First, understand what you have. The emotional side of this market is particularly powerful. A concert shirt is not merely fabric. It can be a physical record of a concert that happened decades ago, a tour that can never happen again, or an artist at a particular point in their career. And eventually, the people who were young enough to attend those concerts become the people with money to buy the memories. That is how nostalgia becomes a market. Number 7. Video games and original consoles. Now we reach a category that may feel much more familiar to younger viewers: video games. The important word here is not simply old, it is completeness. A common game without its packaging may be worth very little. The same title with the original box, manual, inserts, accessories, and excellent condition can tell an entirely different story. And sealed copies occupy another level altogether. The auction market has already demonstrated just how extreme this can become. A sealed copy of Super Mario 64 sold for $1.56 million, showing that a mass-market video game can become an extraordinary collectible when rarity, condition, cultural importance, and preservation meet. That does not mean every old cartridge is valuable. Most are not. But it does mean that the boxes sitting in an attic deserve a second look. Search by exact title. Check the edition. Look for unusual releases. Separate boxed games from loose cartridges. And if you still have original consoles, examine the accessories as well. Controllers, manuals, packaging, cables, and other components can help establish completeness. There is also a practical warning here. Older electronics can contain batteries that eventually leak. If you are preserving old hardware, storage matters. The future value of a collectible can be destroyed by a small piece of corrosion inside a device. What makes video games particularly fascinating is that the generation that played them as children is now growing older. The game is no longer simply a toy, it becomes a memory of childhood. And when that happens across millions of people, collecting can become surprisingly powerful. Number 6. Trading cards. Few things demonstrate the difference between ordinary and extraordinary better than trading cards. A typical bulk collection may contain hundreds of cards worth very little individually. That is why people make a mistake when they sell an entire box without looking through it. The valuable card may be hiding among hundreds of ordinary ones. First editions, early sets, holographic cards, rare variants, exceptional condition, and professionally graded examples can all change the value dramatically. Pokémon has become the obvious modern example, with high-grade early cards such as first edition Charizard reaching prices of hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the same basic principle applies beyond Pokémon. Sports cards can become important when they feature significant rookie appearances or historically important players. The name on the card matters, the edition matters, the condition matters, and sometimes a tiny symbol or printing detail matters. This is why sorting is more important than selling. Do not look at a shoebox and think, these are just old cards. Look at it as a historical archive. Find the earliest sets, separate unusual cards, protect potentially important examples by their edges rather than handling the surfaces unnecessarily. And most importantly, do not assume that a card's age alone makes it valuable. A card can be old and common, another can be comparatively young and extremely scarce. The difference is not simply time, it is supply and demand. And that brings us to the top 5, where the objects become even more revealing. Because from this point onward, the question is not merely whether people collect them, it is why they become emotionally important in the first place. Number 5. Lego sets and minifigures. A box of Lego can look like chaos, hundreds of tiny pieces mixed together, missing instructions, random bricks from different decades. But somewhere in that pile may be something worth investigating. Lego is particularly interesting because collectors have developed a strong market around retired sets, unusual minifigures, limited releases, and complete examples. Sealed sets can be especially desirable. Once a particular set is discontinued, the supply stops increasing in exactly the same way it did during production. Collectors who missed it originally may want one later. Fans who grew up with the theme may eventually want to rebuild it. And parents may discover that the toy their children once begged for has become a piece of nostalgia. Research cited in the reference material has even examined Lego as an alternative collectible investment, with sealed sets showing unusually strong historical returns in certain periods. But the practical lesson is more useful than any percentage. If you have an unopened set, do not open it simply because you want to see what is inside. Preserve the packaging, keep it away from sunlight, and if you have loose Lego, Do not throw the entire box away before examining the minifigures. The small figures can sometimes be more interesting than the bricks surrounding them. There is something almost amusing about the economics of it. A toy designed to be assembled and played with can become more valuable precisely because someone resisted the temptation to play with it. That contradiction appears again and again in collecting. The object was made for use. Its rarity is created when people stop using it. Number 4. Action figures still on their original cards. If you have ever opened a toy and immediately thrown away the packaging, you may have unknowingly destroyed part of its future collectibility. Action figures demonstrate this perfectly. A loose figure that has been played with may be relatively ordinary. The same figure, still sealed against its original card or inside its original packaging, can occupy an entirely different market. Star Wars is perhaps the best-known example, but the principle extends across many toy lines from the 1980s and 1990s. The important details include the exact figure, release variation, packaging, condition, and authenticity. Collectors are not simply buying plastic, they are buying the surviving version of what children actually saw hanging in toy shops decades ago. That makes the packaging part of the historical object. A crushed card can reduce desirability. A damaged blister can matter, missing accessories can matter, and attempts to improve an old collectible can sometimes do more harm than good. This is why untouched condition can be so powerful. The rare survivor may not have been deliberately preserved by a serious collector. Perhaps it was a duplicate gift. Perhaps a child received it and forgot about it. Perhaps a parent placed it in a cupboard and never remembered it. The reason does not matter. The result does. A tiny piece of plastic that was once almost worthless has become a time capsule. And that brings us to a category where tiny differences can create extraordinary results. Number 3. Hot Wheels and other die-cast cars. There is something wonderfully deceptive about a tin full of miniature cars. They are tiny, they are common, they were inexpensive toys. And yet certain examples have become major collectibles. Early Hot Wheels are particularly interesting, especially the so-called red line cars, produced from the late 1960s into the 1970s, identified by the red stripe around their wheels. Depending on the model, color, condition, and rarity, some can sell for hundreds or thousands of dollars. And then there are the extraordinary exceptions. The famous pink rear-loading beach bomb prototype is one of the legendary examples in the category, with values reaching well into 6 figures. The lesson is not that every Hot Wheels car is valuable. It is almost the opposite. The ordinary examples are what make the unusual ones difficult to recognize. If there is a box of old die-cast cars in your home, spread them out. Turn them over. Look at the wheels. Check the base. Look for early dates, unusual colors, variations, and distinctive production details. Do not assume that the most attractive car is the most valuable. In collecting, unusual can be more important than beautiful. A strange color, a manufacturing variation, an experimental design, a version that was produced in tiny numbers. Those are the clues that can change the story. And there is something else worth remembering. These cars survived because people forgot about them. The same box that was too insignificant to sell decades ago may become interesting precisely because most comparable examples disappeared. That is a recurring pattern now, and it takes us directly into the world of early consumer technology. Number 2, early personal technology. There is probably a drawer in your house that everyone calls the junk drawer. Old cables, chargers, mobile phones, portable game systems, small electronic devices that seemed revolutionary when they were new and useless when they stopped.